read and discuss the psalm, we'll stop first and have a word of prayer. So if you would pray with me, please. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this world that you have made. We thank you for the lives that we have, the time that we have to spend studying from your word. Father, we are grateful that you have revealed yourself to us through your word. And we ask that you would bless us at this time as we study from it, that we may better understand you and better understand your will for our lives, that we may serve you with the people that we are and the things that we do. Father, we are grateful for all that you have done and all that you are now doing and all that you will do indeed in the future, but we are most grateful and most thankful that you sent your son Jesus. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. All right, Psalm 62. For the chief musician, after the manner of Jeduthun, a psalm of David. My soul waits in silence for God only. From him comes my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my high tower. I shall not be greatly moved. How long will you set upon a man that you may slay him, all of you, like a leaning wall, like a tottering fence? They only consult to thrust him down from his dignity. They delight in lies. They bless with their mouth, but they curse inwardly. My soul, wait in silence for God only, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my high tower. I shall not be moved. With God is my salvation and my glory. The rock of my strength and my refuge is in God. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Surely men of low degree are a breath, and men of high degree are a lie. In the balances they will go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Trust not in oppression, and become not vain in robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. God has spoken once, twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God. Also to you, O Lord, belongs loving kindness, for you render to every man according to his work. So what is this psalm about? Faith in God, certainly. What else? What about his faith in God? Faith in God to... I'm sorry?
He's telling people.
Okay. There is certainly a portion where he addresses the people themselves, the congregation or the nation, yeah. But he has faith in God to do what? To be what? His rock, sure, yeah. Protection, his salvation, yeah. This is not a psalm like we have had over the last several. This is not particularly a psalm of lament. There seems to be maybe a problem going on, but he's not really complaining about anything. In this psalm, it is much more about expressing confidence. Right? There is not a section at the beginning. So the traditional lament, as we've discussed, and as the last few psalms have been, there is a petition to God, a description of grievances. There is a set of problems that are laid out, a description of what's going wrong, before he expresses a desire for God to intervene. And then commonly at the end of a psalm of lament, confidence comes in that God will indeed act on his behalf, on the behalf of the psalmist. But in this one, we're really kind of missing that first portion. There's not really a big description of complaint or a litany of what it is that is troubling him. There is an expression of what is going on or that there are evil people, but not even in a way of saying, save me from these, but as a way of saying God is already going to deal with this, that these are people that God does not favor. And it is much more from a place of confidence right from the very beginning than a lament would be. It's, in some sense, almost a psalm of praise in some ways that we have here. The focus is on that psalmist's faith, the faith in God that he has, not on his troubles. That's probably the best way to kind of succinctly put that. There's very little in this text to be explicit about exactly who wrote this and when. It is labeled a Psalm of David. As we've discussed, that could just as easily mean a psalm in his style or written after his manner. And there's very little to give us a context of when. It is a very broadly applicable psalm, a very general one that it could apply to very many people in very many circumstances and very many times and places. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more as we get into the middle of this about the timelessness of some of this, perhaps. The form is consistent with David, but the subject is so very general. It's not even necessarily an indication that it was about a king or intended for the king. It could be any individual, really. The very first two verses, and then the verses 5 and 6, form a kind of refrain or summary of the psalm. They're largely repetitive, one of the other. Chorus might be a little bit much. They're not very long, but that repetition kind of gives a theme that repeats midway through as a way of reinforcing the topic. Verse 1 literally begins, "My soul is silence for God alone." The verb here, waits, in most translations, is inferred from the way that this is written. It is actually not appearing here. And you could perhaps infer a different verb if that made sense. There's not one explicitly in the text. The exact line, "My soul is silence for God alone," though it does bespeak a kind of stillness or a kind of patience and waiting that is, again, kind of implied so that we infer that verb of waiting, that he waits in silence for God. And the same thing, the second line is "my salvation from him." The verb here being, saying my salvation comes from him is again inferred as part of what is being spoken. But this is a different way of phrasing it. Again, the lack of that activity, the lack of that action also kind of helps us with that inference, that this is about being patient, about being still, about waiting rather than an active thing on his part, an active thing on the part of the speaker. I just said that, implied by the grammar. The word "alone" here is also a word that has a couple different meanings depending on context. It can also be translated as "truly" or "surely." You'll see in a couple notable translations, the NIV and the King James, they prefer that reading, those translators. They are, I think, the only two of the major translations that do. The rest, ASV, RSV, the New American Standard, etc., go with "alone" rather than "truly" or "surely." The reason for that word being applicable in both ways, it is a little bit of a stretch. We don't do that in English with our word. We don't usually use "alone" as a substitute or an alternative for saying "certainly this is the case." But I would try and make that analogy by saying that if you were to say this is the only reason, this is the only way it can be done, we can see how you could get from that then to certain or surely this is the thing that is going to take place. The idea of it being the only option, the alone option, makes it therefore a certainty that this is the thing that is chosen. And I think that is kind of the connection perhaps in the Hebrew here. That is why it can also be used to mean certainly, truly, surely. So you'll see it differently depending on the emphasis. It probably doesn't matter either way. Whether you're saying that his soul trusts in God alone, that he is waiting in silence only for God, or that he is certainly waiting for God, the import becomes the same. The need to wait on God and the need to trust in him. Verse 2 then goes into the details of the attributes of God that make this possible. Why is it that he can wait patiently for God? What makes that possible? Yeah.
He has expectation that God will come through.
He expects that God will indeed deliver him. Yeah. But why will he expect that of God? He expects that, yes. But why? Why is he confident?
Past history, faith.
His past history of God. Yeah, he knows something about the nature of God. And this is the crucial point. It is not that the psalmist is such a great guy for having such faith in God. It's not that because of who the psalmist is, that he can depend on God for God to save him. It is because of who God is that the psalmist knows that God can be relied upon. This is an important distinction to make, particularly for us as well. We are not so wonderful that God, of course, is going to come and rescue us. We are not so deserving of God's favor that God is going to intervene in our lives. We can be confident in God being who he is, and it is because of God's nature as a good and faithful and loving God that we can then rely and depend on him. Right? We have to make sure that we get this order of events in the correct sequence. Right? We are not wonderful and therefore God will save us. God is wonderful and therefore he will save us. And the psalmist, I think, is recognizing this in that second verse. He lists these various things. Did I put this in the next one? Yeah. He piles them up in quick succession. He refers to God as his rock, as God as his salvation, as a high tower, and he speaks of the immovability of resting in God, as God as being an immovable place. And these are all elements that are contrary to the nature of the world as we see described in other Psalms. In other places, it talks about the earth itself being more mutable, more changeable than God is. That even the mountains will sometimes slide into the sea, but God will not have that happen. Right? He speaks of these qualities and attributes of God, and he mentions them in quick succession to build by that repetition of ideas how secure God is as a place to put one's confidence. It's reiterating that point. It was a very important point to me. I guess I should have put it in, maybe not quite so many times, but I did want to ask one more thing about this. There is a line here, and this is usually put in here slightly differently in the verse 2 than it is in verse 6. He says at the end, I shall not be greatly moved. Why the adverbial addition, greatly?
Because it emphasizes it.
Well, it emphasizes it, but does it mean that he will be moved, but only slightly? I got to know. Does anyone want to take a yes, and then we can argue about it?
The New American Standard says, I shall not be greatly shaken.
Shaken. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the word for the moved here refers to a kind of motion back and forth. Yeah. Yeah, the idea. Sure. Related to the idea of the earth moving, I think, because he speaks again about the tower and the rock. The idea of movement in that fashion, like an earthquake, is particularly apt. But will he be moved slightly? I gotta know. I like your confidence. I think maybe, though.
I just don't see any movement in this.
Well, and that's fine. I think that the important part about this is maybe, again, to consider who and what we are talking about in each case, right? The two persons within this point. We have the psalmist and we have God. And God is immovable. God is immutable. He does not change, he does not alter, and he is utterly dependable and reliable. But we are not the same way. And I think that what the psalmist may be saying, particularly by adding this particular expression, is that he will not be greatly moved off of where he is. That any movement that is result is from the psalmist's own weaknesses. But his faith in God is such that it will not completely push him out of his faith in God. That we can indeed waver. We have moments where our faith is challenged, where it is difficult to see the path forward, right? That we can suffer even though we have faith that God will resolve things. But he will not be greatly moved. Yeah, Keith, go ahead.
My version says I will never be shaken NIV.
Yeah, again, different translations will put that differently. The idea of movement here depends on whether you think of this, yeah.
But this said never, though.
Yeah, it says never, and it depends on, again, whether you think that that is, as a translation, that fits the context of what the psalmist is saying better than the other word. You're not going to find that unanimity, but I think that regardless, the point of what he's saying is largely the same. That our security is not from ourselves, but from our faith in God. Yes, you were going to...
We can be shaken, but we'll come back to center.
Yeah, there is some of that perhaps as well, too. The idea that even though we may waver back and forth, a return to our original position is indicated. Yeah. I would be hesitant, too, to say that it depends on getting back to what Keith was saying, the context of what we mean by shaken or moved, right? If we are never to be moved, I think that would be best understood in the context of our security in God. That God will never be in a position to disappoint us or to leave us in the lurch where we are no longer secure. But that if we are going to say we will not be greatly moved, it is from the perspective of ourselves, right? Is my faith in God always going to be perfect? Am I always going to be utterly reliable and dependent? I'm mixing up my words there maybe a little bit. But am I always going to be perfect in my regard for what God wants and what God has me to do? I mean, my past says no. I have not, and I don't know that I will be ever in the future. But I think I can still at the same time be confident that I will not be greatly moved off of that point. Anyway, I shouldn't belabor this if I ever want to get to anything like close to the end of the... What separates verse 3 from our usual sorts of laments over evil circumstances? So in other laments we have descriptions of the perils, the tribulations that the psalmist will face. How is verse 3 different here from some of those other psalms where these things are described? Yeah.
It seems to be saying that God is a sailing man.
Isn't it saying that God is...
A sailing man.
Okay. Possibly. There's a way of reading it that puts it in those terms. I don't know that I would tend to think of that way. I think of this as being, again, the evil men that are going to do this. Though there are, I think, again, the NIV is the notable translation that does this differently. Yeah.
And then later on it says that you may murder him, all of you. So it's apparently not God.
Yeah, in the NIV, how long will you assault a man? Would you all throw him down this leaning wall, this tottering fence? I think that King James alters the last line in translation to understand it. And again, this isn't changing the original text. It's just simply a way of the words lend themselves to a couple different arrangements. That the evil man is going to be tossed down in the King James, like the tottering wall, or the fence or the wall. That is who is going to be done that way. The NIV and then the ASV, maybe a couple others, they have it so that the evil people are picking on those that are already in trouble and trying to knock down those that are in some way weakened already. Regardless, I think that the key here is that he sounds essentially disdainful of the evil men. It's not as if they are a severe threat. The question is a rhetorical one. How long are you going to keep this up? How long will you keep pushing on this when it's not going to work? You will not ultimately be successful. Right? How long are they going to keep this nonsense going? I don't know. Maybe you may feel differently, and if you do, that's fine. But to me, there's a distinction here in this verse in the way that the evil is described, in the way that the peril is described from evil men, to other psalms where the lament is stronger. It's really just the one verse. The verse 4 is descriptive of who they are, but really not about the peril that they are causing or any danger that is from them. rather more descriptive of the nature of the evil men. And this is the only real section of lament that we get in this psalm, and it's half of one, perhaps. The root of the word here for kill or slay that occurs in the middle of this, the NIV has throw him down, is a word related to breaking down of buildings for destruction, which makes it particularly apt for the metaphor at the end of the fence or the wall, right? That they are going to cast down a person in the same way that you would cast down a wall, right? That they will attack or assail him in order to bring him down in that manner. I knew I had this in the translations differ on who the leaning wall is, whether it is the psalmist or the evil men. Whether it is the psalmist under attack, attacking him as if he were the leaning wall, or whether God will then punish them in this matter and they will fall as if they were already tottering. There are some people that will pick a particular translation or an understanding of that going on from verse 4. What follows it, speaking of someone of dignity, someone who is a lofty place, right? They will use that line to kind of understand backwards what was meant in the one before, that a man of dignity could not necessarily be someone who is tottering or leaning, weakened. That this speaks of someone who is in some place elevated or has a high position in society. I'm unconvinced by that. I don't think that necessarily follows. I think you can easily have someone in a high position that is susceptible to all kinds of problems. And perhaps they are merely seeking to drag everyone down to their own level. This is a common element of someone who is envious, being led into evil, right? That if I cannot have what you have, then perhaps none of us should have it, right? That they are just simply trying to drag them down rather than to gain by what is done. I think that this is at root kind of the nature of what evil is. Destructive. I have nihilistic on there, that it is evil seeks to destroy or to create nothing. That it is, probably owe this idea to C.S. Lewis or someone, that it is parasitic, that it requires the nature of good, the existence of things in order for itself to exist, because it does not of its own create or have material. It only can live off of or derive its substance from destroying that which is already good in there. All right. Verse 4 also speaks of hypocrisy. At the end, they say one thing and desire another. They speak their blessings, but they think their curses. These are things that are commonly spoken of about the Pharisees by Jesus in the Gospels. He refers to them as hypocrites many times over. The idea that you say one thing, perhaps even good things, but your intentions or your desires are at odds with the things that you say. This duplicitous nature of evil. Those that want bad while speaking good. The implication appears to be the danger from false friends or hidden enemies, perhaps, for the psalmist. Someone who is against him, but it is difficult to discern who. The whispering campaign, people starting rumors about you behind your back, as it were. Then we have verse 5. There's a slight change from verse 1, right? It's almost the exact same verse, but instead of salvation, they have the word hope. We have the word hope here in verse 5, which is at odds slightly with verse 1. My soul wait in silence for God only, for my hope is from him. Why would there be a change from salvation to hope? Just a little linguistic variety to keep you from falling asleep while you're hearing the psalm, keep you on your toes while you're singing and reciting. Is there a difference between salvation and hope? Obviously, yes, they're different words.
Just taking a guess at that. Salvation is God's plan to be with him forever and ever. Hope is that faith that will happen.
Yeah,
It's seeing what faith is believing what you can't see, that it's going to be there for you from his promise.
yeah, it's expressing a very similar idea from a slightly different perspective, right? Saying that God is his salvation is more God is going to act on my behalf, and now God is my hope, meaning that I am putting my hope in God for my salvation. It is approaching the same idea or concept from the two different directions, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it is largely the same, but again, just giving a different facet or a different look at the same idea. Dennis? Yeah.
Salvation sounds like it's a done deal.
Yes. It is as if it were already accomplished in some sense. And it is, right? This is one of the common ways in which the Psalms are written, is to write some of the lines or some of the words as if it were already done. This is more common at the end of a psalm, right, where the psalmist speaks of his confidence in God's actions by speaking of it in the past tense as if it had already been accomplished. But yeah, it is a common thing to do it that way. The other thing is that the verb at the beginning, or the way that this is expressed, the silence idea, is spoken here in the verse 5 as an imperative, rather than as simply an infinitive verb, maybe. He says at the verse time, my soul finds rest in God alone, or my soul waits in silence for God only. And now he says, my soul waits in silence for God only. He is, instead of speaking of a thing that he is doing, he is now commanding himself or speaking to himself as if to tell himself to do this thing. That in the midst of turmoil, he is using that imperative way of speaking in order to reinforce or reassure himself to act in that fashion. Right? In the same way that I don't know, maybe you don't do this, but in moments of stress, I will sometimes tell myself, right, and it's very tense, okay, calm down, speaking to myself. And that imperative way of speaking to yourself is as if commanding yourself is a way of emphasizing to yourself the importance of behaving in that way. And he shifts to the imperative here in verse 5 to say that. Six becomes a word-for-word repetition of 2. 7 is a clear declaration of who God is, and he's building on verse 6. So he speaks of his rock, his salvation, his high tower, and then he goes on, with God is my salvation and my glory, the rock of my strength and my refuge is in God. He is continuing to pile up these descriptions or these metaphors for who God is as a way of continuing to emphasize to the hearer, and I think also to himself, the need to depend on God and to rest in God for his salvation. Again, the psalm is one of a great deal of confidence, but it is at the same time also a way of reassuring himself, the speaker, as well as anyone who will hear later, of the need to continue to do this. Do we do this same sort of thing ourselves with our songs? I'd say yeah.
To reassure ourselves, to keep reassuring ourselves?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes, I think we do.
I think we clearly do. The hymns that we sing say things that we already know. right? How often do you sing a song and there's a bit of theology in there or scripture that you're like, oh, I didn't know that. That's new. It's not that often, I don't think. Right? We sing about God loving us. Did we not know that already? I mean, if you're new, if you're a visitor, you've never been to church, maybe not, but... Or we sing about heaven being a reward at the end of our lives. Did we not know that already? But this repetition, this reinforcing of this idea, this telling ourselves again, helps to fully ingrain that and to make that more of a deep dyed knowledge than just simply a surface kind of idea. That it becomes part of who we are rather than just simply something that we encounter only on Sundays. It inculcates this concept within us deeply so that we can live with that and live our lives in a way that has that ingrained and influences us even when we're not here. Because ideally, right, these ideas, these concepts are things that we don't just experience here and now in this building for a couple hours. We live our lives. Yes, sir?
Ephesians 5:19, speak to one another in psalms and hymns.
Yeah. Yeah, the injunction is there even in the New Testament, that these are things that we are to say to one another in order to reinforce these ideas. Yeah. All right, I'm running short. We'll see how we get to that. 8 appears to begin a section of instruction to the congregation or hearers generally. We see that there is a shift in the way that he is speaking, from speaking of my soul, how long will you set upon a man, he is my rock and salvation, etc., to shifting, trust in him at all times, you people, pour out your heart before him. What does he mean by that image of pouring out one's heart?
Give your heart.
Okay, to give or to give one's heart. What do we mean by that? How do you? I'm not.
Spiritually give.
Okay, give it spiritually.
All of it, everything your heart has. Take it.
Yeah,
To surrender.
yeah. I think that's right on the nose. Is that it is the idea of emptying of ourselves, right? That everything that we have and who we are needs to be put before God. That we don't hold things back, right? Yeah.
Sincerely, you pray your heart, really go talk to God. What you need, what you need from Him to help you. When you pray your heart, you're in tears, God, help me. This is my limit, I'm beyond. So he's praying his heart to God, help him through everything. It's like, God, help us all the time. And when we are sincere, when we just do it for a joke, it's not going to work.
Yeah, it speaks of sincerity, and I think of the totality as well, right? That there are not things that we hold back from God that we don't give up, right? The pouring out of our heart, the emptying of ourselves from our most inmost being is the giving up of everything that we have to the power of God, of surrendering ourselves entirely, right? The metaphor again of pouring, right? To empty out or to dump out entirely. And then of the heart as well, right? The place within ourselves that is closely identified with our identity, with ourselves. Yeah, our spirit and soul. Yeah, exactly. This is because God is a refuge from all of the things that we suffer, right? There is nothing that we can gain, nothing that we profit by, nothing that is to our benefit if we hold back from giving ourselves up to God. There is no reason for those that trust God, that put their faith in Him, to hold back from putting their entire faith, putting their whole selves into His hands. And so the injunction from the psalmist is to do it wholeheartedly and without reservation. Yeah. We did get here. I was excited. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was about to emphasize more on that. See,
Please.
To me, God is black and white. Either you do or you don't. So you don't do anything half. You do the whole, or you don't do it at all.
Yeah, I would agree completely that the idea of doing things or thinking of it in, as you say, shades of gray instead of black and white is anathema to the nature of who God is. Yeah. He is entirely one thing. Yeah. Yeah. Verse 9 is very reminiscent of Ecclesiastes. The language here, the word used is the same word, translated as vanity or breath, depending on your translation. It is the same word that is used throughout Ecclesiastes as kind of that key word within that book. Speaking of the nature of the world, in this case here, specifically of people themselves. Here in verse 9, the men of low degree or high degree. It is that same timeless wisdom that this is, I think, that true in all times and all places. It is the same lesson that Ecclesiastes has of things not altering can be applied here, that this is no longer going to be a difference. So what then is the difference between the lowly and the noble that he is expressing here? I think that there is still a difference, but what is the difference? It's a little bit of a trick question, I'll admit. I don't normally do that. The big difference is that you think there's a difference. The difference is that people are fooled into believing there's a difference. He says that the men of low degree are a breath, the men of high degree are a lie. The lie is that there is a difference between these two kinds of men. Right? Men of wealth and men who are poor, they're both men. And it's a lie to think that the men of wealth are better in some way, or worthier in some way. We are all the same before God, and there's a lie that some of us are in some way elevated. Yes?
And they're both of no substance.
And when you put them together, it is the same as if you had only kept them separate. Yeah, they're both without substance before God. He goes on to say that in the second half, right? They are together lighter than a breath. Right? Men of low degree are a breath, men of high degree are a lie. Balances, they go up because together they are lighter than a breath. Even when you put them together, there is no more weight to it. The lie is that you can have a person of greater substance and value. We don't have value apart from God. We are nothing on our own. We're worthless. This is, the image of the balances kind of is an image of judgment, right? We have the two images from law. I think we probably borrow this from the Greeks, but the image of justice, the sword and the scales, right, is the image of what justice, blind justice, but the blindfold is always pictured holding the sword for justice and punishment and the scales for judgment. And when we are weighed in the scales, no matter what you put on the other side, we still go up. We have no weight or substance. Yeah?
Not to get metaphysical, without God, the universe collapses.
Yeah, no, and that's certainly, yes. I think in this case, it's really the focus is probably more on the individuals, but you're right. You're right, that there's nothing that exists that does not continue to exist without the exertion of God's will. Yes. Yes, creation exists solely through the exertion of God's will. It's a continuous matter. Yeah. Yeah. All right, I'm running short. I've seen a couple small children walk by the back here. Nothing about impression, that's what I was just saying. Talked about the balances. The last thing, we'll just talk about 10. I have to skip the last couple verses. 10 is a warning not to misplace your faith. He has talked about where to put your faith and where to seek your salvation, who God is, and how our faith in him, right, is going to be your refuge and is going to save you. But he speaks in 10 about the seeking of wealth and how it cannot save you. Trust not in oppression. Do not become vain in robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Wealth, however obtained, does not endure or preserve you. As easily as it can arrive, it can go away and fail you. The permanent things, the only permanent thing, is our faith in God. All right, well, I didn't get to the last couple of verses, but I have used up my time and a little bit more besides. Any final thought, any final comment, final question? All right, well, I appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate it this morning, and we will